There's a question geneticists have been quietly arguing over in labs from Harvard to Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, not in press releases, not in headlines, in closed rooms, staring at data sets that upend a lot of what we thought we understood about human history. Researchers took DNA from Jewish populations, one of the world's oldest surviving civilizations, and ran it against every major ancient civilization on record. Egyptians, Romans, Babylonians, Greeks, Persians, Phoenicians, dozens of ancient groups, thousands of years of history, and out of all of them, only one came back as a genuine match. Just one. And what that match points to reshapes how you think about identity, history, and time itself. Something odd happens once you start sequencing ancient DNA and lining it up against modern populations. The data doesn't cooperate with the story historians expected. Empires that looked permanent, cultures that seemed unshakable, and bloodlines assumed to carry on. Most of them simply disappear from the genetic record. They're absorbed, replaced, and diluted past recognition, generation after generation, until whatever biological thread once linked the living to the ancient snaps entirely. That's the fate of most great ancient civilizations. Their languages died out, their religions morphed into something else, and their genetic signatures dissolved into the populations around them. The people who claim descent from those old worlds are, more often than not, connected only in a partial, symbolic, or cultural sense. The biology says something else. Except for one case, one population where the genetic evidence keeps circling back to the same ancestral point of origin. A group whose DNA, set against the ancient populations of the Levant, Bronze Age Canaan, and the Iron Age Near East, produces a signal strong and consistent enough that separate research teams, working on different continents across different decades, keep landing on the same conclusion. That population is the Jewish people. But this is where things stop being simple and where most casual readers tune out, because the real science underneath this is far messier, far stranger, and far more contested than any single headline could capture. So let's rewind, not to the origins of the Jewish people, but to the origins of the science itself. Back in the early 1990s, population genetics was still a young discipline, and scientists were only starting to grasp that DNA could do more than identify individuals. It could trace entire migration routes, ancient family networks, and population histories going back millennia. The human genome, with its billions of base pairs, turned out to function like an archive, a biological record of every migration, every bottleneck, and every mixing event a population had lived through over thousands of years. And researchers realized something remarkable. Read that archive correctly, and you could theoretically reconstruct where people came from, who their ancestors were, and whether the origin stories they'd carried for generations were genetically grounded or purely mythical. The Jewish people made for an especially compelling test case because here was a population dispersed across the entire globe for close to 2,000 years. After Rome destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE and scattered Jewish communities into what became the diaspora, Ashkenazi Jews settled across Central and Eastern Europe, while Sephardic Jews put down roots in Spain and Portugal, later moving into North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Mizrahi Jews stayed largely in the Middle East and Persia, while Yemenite Jews evolved in near complete isolation on the Arabian Peninsula. And yet, every one of these communities held onto a shared identity, a shared religious framework, and crucially, a shared claim of common ancient descent. The question was whether DNA could actually back that up. The first real signal didn't come from autosomal DNA at all, but from one narrow strand of evidence, the Y-chromosome, tracing the paternal line. In 1997, Dr. Carl Skorecki and his colleagues published a study in Nature built around a simple but bold premise. Jewish tradition holds that the Kohanim, the priestly line of Judaism descended from Aaron, Moses' brother, preserved an unbroken father-to-son lineage across more than 3,000 years. There were no written genealogical records, just oral transmission surviving exile, persecution, and the collapse of the very institutions the priesthood once served. The researchers wanted to know if that claim held up biologically. What they discovered froze the scientific community in its tracks. Kohanim men, regardless of whether they were Ashkenazi from Poland, Sephardic from Morocco, or Mizrahi from Iraq, shared a strikingly similar Y-chromosome pattern, now known as the Cohen Modal Haplotype. Consider what that implies. These communities had been separated for centuries, many never crossing paths, speaking different languages, and following different local customs. Yet the Y-chromosome data traces back to one shared paternal ancestor, a single man who, by the calculations, lived roughly 3,200 years ago in the ancient Near East. Later refinements of the haplotype, using far more advanced tools, show it present in nearly 30% of Kohanim Y chromosomes across every major Jewish community on Earth. It's almost non-existent outside Jewish populations, and it traces back to the same corridor of land, the Levant, covering modern Israel, the Palestinian territories, Lebanon, and parts of Syria and Jordan. But that was only the opening act, because the Y chromosome tells you about one narrow paternal thread. Scientists wanted the full picture, What would autosomal DNA, inherited from both parents and representing a population's complete genetic makeup, reveal when set against ancient civilizations? That's where the research entered a much richer, much more complicated phase. Through the 2000s and 2010s, breakthroughs in ancient DNA extraction changed what was achievable. Scientists could now sequence genomes from people dead for thousands of years, Bronze Age farmers, Iron Age soldiers, and ancient urban dwellers, and compare those genomes against living populations with a precision nobody thought possible before. The field of archaeogenetics emerged, and it began quietly rewriting conventional historical narratives, one data set at a time. Major research institutions, Harvard's ancient DNA lab under geneticist David Reich, the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig, the Weizmann Institute of Science, Tel Aviv University, and Hebrew University of Jerusalem, began systematically mapping the ancient genetic landscape of the Levant. They dug up sites across modern Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories, extracting DNA from 93 ancient individuals spanning roughly 2400 BCE to 900 BCE, from the early Bronze Age through the late Bronze Age into the Iron Age. They analyzed and modeled these ancient genomes against modern populations using statistical methods rigorous enough to be published simultaneously across multiple peer-reviewed journals. Here's what emerged. The ancient Canaanites, Bronze Age inhabitants of the southern Levant, the same population and setting that corresponds archaeologically to the world described in the biblical narrative of ancient Israel, left behind a distinct, traceable genetic signature. Compared against modern populations worldwide, that signature produced a clear hierarchy of genetic closeness. Most populations showed essentially no meaningful connection. The ancient Canaanites were simply too far removed, geographically and in time, from groups in, say, Scandinavia or East Asia. But when researchers compared that ancient Canaanite signature against modern Jewish populations across every diasporic community, the link was unmistakable. Shared ancestry exceeded 50%. More than half the genetic makeup of modern Jewish communities traces directly back to these Bronze Age Levantine populations, regardless of whether that community spent the last 1,000 years in Germany, Morocco, Iraq, or Yemen. Sit with that for a moment. More than 2,000 years of geographic separation, and the ancestral signal held at that intensity. But here's where it gets genuinely thornier, because the science refuses to tell a tidy story. It tells a dense, layered one that complicates both those who'd use genetics to make sweeping nationalist arguments and those who'd use it to wave away ancient connections altogether. Studies of Ashkenazi genetics, the population whose ancestors settled the Rhine Valley in western Germany around the 10th century CE before spreading across Central and Eastern Europe, reveal a genome that's genuinely mixed. The most thorough analyses, including a landmark 2024-2025 study out of Hebrew University and Harvard Medical School, the largest ancient DNA study of Jewish individuals ever conducted, modeled Ashkenazi ancestry as somewhere between 37% and 65% Southern European, layered on top of a Middle Eastern ancestral core. A medieval bottleneck in the 14th century when persecution, plague, and forced expulsion decimated Ashkenazi populations, compressed the group down to a remarkably small founding population, shaping the genetic patterns visible today. Think about what that means for questions of identity and ancestry. The Ashkenazi genome isn't a pristine transmission straight from antiquity. It carries genetic traces of the European populations Ashkenazi Jews lived alongside and traded with, and despite strict cultural endogamy, inevitably mixed with to some degree over the centuries. None of this is hidden. It's simply science, and it's genuinely complicated. But here's the thread the research community keeps returning to, the thing that makes the Jewish genetic story unlike almost any other in the ancient world. The Middle Eastern ancestral core never vanished. No matter which Jewish community you look at, no matter how far from the ancestral homeland, and no matter how many centuries of separation, that Levantine signal keeps showing up. According to people close to the archaeogenetics field, this degree of ancestral persistence over such extreme distances of time and geography is genuinely rare in the whole history of human population genetics. Compare that to what happened to other ancient civilizations, Pharaonic Egypt, the pyramid builders, the worshippers of Ra and Osiris, the civilization that developed writing alongside Mesopotamia, left behind its own genetic record. But modern Egyptians carry substantial input from later migrations, notably from sub-Saharan Africa during the medieval period, and from Arabian populations following the 7th century Islamic conquests. The ancestral line is partial and repeatedly interrupted. Ancient Rome, architect of Western legal tradition and ruler of territory from Britain to Mesopotamia, left an equally fractured inheritance. Modern Italians carry the imprint of several later migration waves, and the specific genetic profile of the 1st century BCE Roman aristocracy isn't cleanly traceable in any single modern group today. The Greeks, Persians, Babylonians, and Phoenicians all experienced admixture on a scale that leaves their ancestral signal detectable in fragments, but not uniquely or predominantly concentrated in any one modern population. The Jewish genetic story runs differently, and the reason comes down to one cultural practice: endogamy, marrying within the community, not as some doctrine of racial purity, but as a religious and social norm that Jewish communities upheld with varying strictness across the entire 2,000-year span of the diaspora. Combined with small community sizes, that endogamy produced what geneticists call a founder effect on a civilizational scale. Genetic diversity within Jewish populations runs lower than in the populations surrounding them. Certain markers are dramatically overrepresented, and the ancestral signal from the ancient Levant, despite everything history threw at these communities, stayed encoded in the genomes of their descendants. What most people miss is the full weight of what this implies for how we understand human history. We're used to thinking of identity as mostly cultural, linguistic, or religious, and for most populations across history, those cultural markers eventually detach from their biological origins. Languages shift, religions spread far beyond their founding communities, civilizations get conquered and absorbed. The Jewish case presents something the human sciences almost never encounter: a population whose biological, cultural, religious, and ancestral identity has stayed measurably coherent across roughly 3,000 to 4,000 years of continuous recorded history. DNA isn't the whole story. It can't tell you what being Jewish means, but it does something equally remarkable. It confirms that the people telling this story today are, in a real and scientifically measurable way, connected to the people who first told it. And this is where things really shift, because the science doesn't stop at confirming continuity. It goes further and gets more specific, in ways with immediate implications for archaeology, history, and centuries of scholarly debate over ancient identity. A 2005 mitochondrial DNA study by Joseph Livni and Karl Skorecki, the same Skorecki who co-discovered the Cohen Modal Haplotype decades earlier, examined Ashkenazi maternal lineages using a new methodological approach. Earlier researchers had disagreed over whether the founding maternal population of Ashkenazi Jewry was primarily Levantine or primarily European. Some studies suggested Ashkenazi maternal ancestry came largely from European women who converted or were absorbed into Jewish communities during the medieval period. That was a contentious claim. The newer study tackled it head-on by developing a method for distinguishing founding maternal lineages, those that arrived with the original Levantine community from lineages absorbed later. The conclusion was sharp. Fewer than 15% of individuals in the Ashkenazi maternal sample carried absorbed lineages. Most Ashkenazi maternal ancestry traces to a founding group of roughly 54 original matrilineal lines, and those founder lines don't support a primarily European maternal origin. The bigger story isn't just where Jewish DNA came from, it's what DNA can and can't prove, and what happens when ancient genetic data runs headfirst into modern political reality. Because the same body of research confirming Jewish ancestral ties to the ancient Levant also shows, with equal rigor, that modern Palestinians carry a primary ancestral core from those same Bronze Age Levantine populations, at rates between 81 and 87% in some analyses. The ancient land wasn't empty before any one group's arrival. The genetic record points to continuous habitation, continuous presence, and deep shared ancestry between multiple communities who today find themselves locked in political conflict over the same territory. The ancient Canaanite wasn't the exclusive ancestor of any single modern group. In a very real sense, the ancient Canaanite is the shared ancestor of several peoples now contesting the same land. That's not chaos, that's history. And history is rarely as clean as any political narrative would like it to be. According to people close to the ancient DNA research community, the most significant finding of the last decade of Levantine archaeogenetics isn't about whose claim to the land is stronger. That's a political question, and DNA can't answer political questions. The bigger finding is that the ancient Levant, from the earliest periods of civilization, was a zone of extraordinary genetic churn. Populations moved through it constantly. Populations mixed within it constantly. The Bronze Age individuals excavated from sites across modern Israel, the West Bank, Lebanon, and Jordan were themselves genetic blends, mixtures of earlier Neolithic Levantine farmers and migrants tied to populations from the Zagros Mountains in what's now western Iran. The so-called Megiddo outliers, 3 individuals buried together at the ancient site of Megiddo, whose genomes carried noticeably more Caucasus-related ancestry than their neighbors, suggest migration waves from the northeast kept arriving in the region well into the late 2nd millennium BCE. The ancient world wasn't static. It was constant motion, constant mixing, constant transformation. What makes the Jewish genetic story remarkable in that context isn't purity, because no such thing exists anywhere in human genetics. What makes it remarkable is persistence. The thread pulled from ancient Canaan and the wider ancient Near East, frayed by time, thickened by admixture, thinned by persecution and repeated population bottlenecks, still runs continuously from antiquity to the present in a way that genetic data can detect, measure, and confirm. Look at the geographic specificity of the signal. Haplogroup J, especially J1 and J2, the Y-chromosome lineages, most closely tied to ancient Semitic populations, and the ancient Levant, shows up across Jewish communities worldwide at frequencies far too high to be coincidence. J1, sometimes called the Semitic marker, reaches its peak frequency and genetic diversity in the ancient Fertile Crescent, Iraq, and around Zagros range, spreading west and south through the Levant. It's present across Ashkenazi, Sephardic, and Mizrahi communities, and it shows up among Kohanim at extraordinary concentrations. The specific sublineage JP58, ancestral to the Cohen Modal Haplotype, traces in the archaeological record to a male ancestor living roughly 3,200 years ago in the Near East. That date, within the margins of genetic dating, lines up with the period biblical tradition associates with the formation of the ancient Israelite priestly class. That alignment is worth sitting with. Genetic dating isn't exact. It runs on statistical models, mutation rate calculations, and population modeling that all carry built-in uncertainty. And yet, independent teams, using different methods, keep converging on dates and locations that match the historical and archaeological record of ancient Israelite civilization in the southern Levant. That's not proof of any specific biblical narrative being literally true, but in scientific terms, it's what researchers call concordant. The genetic findings are concordant with a historical account of the Jewish people descending from ancient Hebrew and Israelite residents of the Levant. Those aren't a theologian's words. They're the words of scientists, published in peer-reviewed journals, based on thousands of DNA samples drawn from across the Jewish diaspora. But here's the question science can't answer, and no amount of sequencing will ever resolve. What does it mean that a population can carry the biological imprint of its ancient homeland for 3,000 years while living in exile? What does it mean that the human genome can preserve, across hundreds of generations, the geographic coordinates of a civilization's origin? What does it mean that the same blood, altered by time, mixed with dozens of other populations, compressed by bottlenecks and expanded by migration, can still, in a 21st century lab, point back across millennia to a specific strip of coastline on the eastern Mediterranean? What most people miss is that this question reaches far beyond Jewish history. It's about what human identity actually is, and about the relationship between biology and meaning. It's about whether the stories communities tell about themselves, origin, covenant, descent, return, are simply cultural inventions, or whether they can carry something encoded in the body's own chemistry that's more durable, more persistent, and stranger than we currently know how to explain. The science is moving faster than the philosophy needed to hold it. Every new ancient DNA study adds more data points, and every new population genetics paper sharpens the model. Every refinement both confirms what was already suspected and opens fresh questions nobody yet knows how to answer. A 2024 study in Cell, the largest ancient DNA study of Jewish individuals ever conducted, from researchers at Hebrew University and Harvard Medical School, uncovered unexpected genetic subgroups within the medieval Ashkenazi community of Erfurt, Germany. It turns out the medieval Ashkenazi population was more genetically diverse than its modern descendants. The founder event, the bottleneck that shaped modern Ashkenazi genetics, happened after the medieval period, not before it, which means the genetic story of Jewish ancestry is still being written. New excavations keep producing new remains. New sequencing technology keeps pulling data from material once considered too degraded to analyze. New computational methods let researchers model ancestral populations at a resolution that would have sounded like science fiction 20 years ago. Whatever comes next won't simplify things. If anything, the trajectory points toward more complexity, more nuance, and more historical depth than any single narrative, genetic, religious, nationalist, or otherwise, has managed to hold so far. Here's what we actually know, stated plainly, without agenda or oversimplification. Scientists compared Jewish DNA, Ashkenazi, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Yemenite, and other communities against the ancient populations of the Levant, Bronze Age Canaanites, Iron Age inhabitants of the southern Levant, and dozens of other ancient civilizations from across the ancient world. They used the most advanced genetic tools available. They published in the field's most rigorous peer-reviewed journals, and the results produced a consistent signal across studies, across methods, and across research teams with no shared institutional affiliation or ideological stake. The ancestral connection between modern Jewish communities and the ancient populations of the Levant is, within what genetics can actually measure, real. It's not the only story the data tells. It's not clean or simple, and it doesn't settle the political questions various parties have tried to attach to it. But it's there, encoded in the genome, persisting across millennia, surviving exile, persecution, dispersion, and everything else. The last 2,000 years of history could throw at a people. And the ancient civilization that matched, not the Egyptians, not the Romans, not the Greeks, the Persians, or the Babylonians. It was the population of the ancient Levant, the Bronze and Iron Age inhabitants of a narrow strip of land along the eastern Mediterranean coast. A civilization known to history by many names: Canaanite, Israelite, Judean, Levantine, but known to genetics by one single, consistent, measurable signature. And that signature reappears 3,000 years later in Jewish communities spread across 6 continents. What does that tell us about the nature of identity? About the relationship between a people and the land they came from? About what survives in human beings across the longest stretches of recorded time? About whether the past is ever truly past or whether it keeps living literally, biochemically, measurably in the bodies of those who came after? The science has handed us new data. It hasn't handed us new answers. The questions are bigger than ever. And the next discovery, the next excavation, the next genome pulled from the ground and read in a lab might change everything we thought we understood. Or it might just confirm once more that certain threads, once pulled from the fabric of human history, can't be broken. They can only be traced backward through time, deeper into the past, toward an origin the biology still remembers even after the history books go quiet. The data's in. The match is confirmed. But what that match actually means, that question is still wide open, and it might be one of the most important questions of our time.